Thank you for your presence this morning. And again, I'll just echo what was said before Bible class and what Fred said by way of welcome, especially to our mothers. We children may not always have said or even say now how much we appreciate you. You are a corner building stone for families, and we appreciate you so very, very much. There's a story told about two steamships leaving Memphis with cargo. And they were kind of rivals as far as the crews were concerned, and so they started out down the Mississippi River toward New Orleans. Both ships were laden with cargo. And as they were kind of side by side, close enough where they could yell at one another and taunt one another, they decided, let's have a race. And so they fueled up the boilers and got up steam and started traveling down the Mississippi as fast as they possibly could. And there was one ship that seemed like it was going to win without a doubt until it realized it didn't have any more fuel. So someone on board that ship decided, you know what, I bet we can take some of this cargo and put it into the boiler and we'll just have the steam that we need. And it worked. And sure enough, they caught up with the other ship and they found out that cargo would do just as good as that coal or as that wood. So they started taking all the cargo and putting it into the fire. And sure enough, that one ship, that steamboat, went off and left the other one and arrived in New Orleans before the other one even thought about getting there. Now stop and think about that for just a moment. There's plenty of lessons to be learned, but there's one in particular. If cargo has been entrusted to you, it is your responsibility to safeguard it and give it back to its owner. Now, I want you to remember that particular point as we go through this particular lesson. And yes, we're going to be talking about, as a foundation of this lesson, two mothers. And that was talked about in that scripture that Ethan read to us. So stop and think about those two mothers and how they protected their precious cargo. And if you remember that passage, Paul was talking to Timothy and telling Timothy how much he appreciated his godliness and his commitment to the cause of Christ. But then he singles out Timothy's mother and grandmother and said that faith was first of all in them. You were the recipient of what you are, of what they gave to you. They safeguarded their precious cargo. They were not going to allow that cargo to be burned up. So that's what I want us to understand. While the two mothers are the foundation of the lesson, every one of these points apply to each one of us. And we have a responsibility because of what God has given us, the cargo, if you will, to protect it, to safeguard it, to make sure that it is given back to the Father in the proper way. So let's start talking about that cargo. And Timothy was indeed their cargo. Now, if you'll turn to Acts chapter 14 or Acts chapter 16. Acts chapter 14 talks about how Paul and his companions had come into Derbe and Iconium, and they were preaching the word. But it's really telling in Acts chapter 16 about Timothy. Acts chapter 16. Verse 1, it says, "And he came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there, named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium." That speaks volumes about Timothy. He was well spoken of by his brothers and sisters there at that church. And I submit to you that he had that reputation because of what he had learned from his mother and grandmother. They were bound and determined. They were so desirous of him becoming what God would have him become, that they wanted to make sure that he had the proper education. So let's talk about the cargo that they had and the cargo that we have. And that cargo is called time. There's a religious research group called Barna, and they have observed that there are 3 primary influences that shape our children. 3. And I think every one of these, especially for mothers and grandmothers, but also for fathers, we need to understand what those influences are. And it all has to do with the way that we use our time. The first one is media. When we talk about media, we're not just talking about TV, we're not talking about the movies, but we're talking about what they see on the internet. Talking about the images that come across. These things are helping to shape their worldview. The worldview is how the world is saying you should live, the morality you should possess, the actions that you should take, the interactions that should be part of your life. And the world is saying everything but get closer to God. The world is saying that you need just to take care of yourself. And if it means that you are to be selfish, that's okay. But the media is trying to shape the worldview for your children. I thought this was an interesting statistic. By the time your children graduate high school, they would have been exposed to 16,000 hours of media. What are our children watching? What is being poured into their hearts and into their brain? What is their worldview based upon what the world wants to teach them? And then there's the second influence, the law of the land. Our children are seeing time and time again that what they may be receiving at home is different. You may be trying to teach your children godly things, but the law of the land says it is man who is the authority. It is man who sets the rules. It is man who dictates how we should live. We will legislate your morality. We will legislate your actions. And so a child grows up and says, well, the law says this, therefore it must be right. Not stopping to consider, because of the worldview that the media has presented, not stopping to consider that that's against the will of God. I often heard an individual where I preached one time make the statement, just because it's legal, it doesn't mean that it's right. And I think you understand what the person was trying to say. It's not right in the eyes of God. It may be legal in the eyes of man. And so when our children grow up and they hear man making these laws and they're taught you need to obey the law, well, we've got to do what the law says regardless of what God says. And so that's the second influence that helps to shape their worldview. And then there's parental influence. Barna found that only 4% of the millennials have a biblical worldview. 4%. And that's one of the 3 major influences shaping the worldview. 4% only have a biblical worldview. On average, families only spend 27 minutes of quality time together on weekdays and 2 hours together on weekends. Now, I'm not saying that's just part of this group here, but this is what we're seeing in the world. And we're wondering why our children are being lost, why our offspring are being called up into the world and to the ugliness of the world. I have to think about Eunice and Lois as they sit their young Timothy in front of them, and they took the time to talk about God, to talk about how He saved His people coming out of bondage, how he forgave time and time again, and how he was gracious, and how he was merciful, and how he had a plan, and that plan was going to be fulfilled as the prophets talked about through Jesus. What an education Timothy received. It's because people took their time. Two mothers, a grandmother and a mother, took their time to sit down with that child and instill within him God's view. I've often wondered as I thought about Timothy's father. He was a Greek, and the Greeks were this all big on knowledge, worldly knowledge, and how that might have presented a conflict as mom and grandmom were sitting there and teaching him about God and the truth of God. And Dad maybe sitting over there in the corner shaking his head. Can't believe you're teaching my child that. Or maybe Dad just didn't have time to even think about those type of things. But that mother and grandmother were not going to burn that cargo of time. I imagine they had teachable moments. All our teachers in here, how often you had principals tell you, use the teachable moments? When an opportunity comes up, it may not be in the lesson plan, but that's a teachable moment, and so you take advantage of that. And if you'll look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, 4 through 9, the Lord talked about teachable moments. Making that effort and taking that time to use those various objects to teach about God. Don't allow yourself to miss the opportunity. It's what the Lord is trying to say in that particular passage. Ephesians 6:4 talks about, fathers, bring your children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. What's involved in that commandment? Well, there's training. I think we all know what training is all about. And the various things we did with our children as they were growing up, we tried to train them. What was right? What was wrong? What to stay away from? Sometimes they didn't listen, but it doesn't mean that the training wasn't the right training. And Paul is saying, bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Teach them. Use those teachable moments. It is a deliberate, planned instruction. It is the intentional teaching of standards. Intentional. That means you have made a determination that my child is going to learn this. We make sure they do their homework, I hope. My granddaughter, youngest one, had a project. And I thought it was kind of innovative with her teacher. They were to pick a country. And they had to do a whole, like a book report on that country. Then they had to dress up in that attire that represented that country. And then they had to make something that was part of the food of that country. And I watched her as she was going through this, and I'm thinking, boy, that teacher's got something on the ball, trying to get those kids deeply involved in an understanding and use the various methods there to drive home the points. I understand her cake was really good. But, and by the way, it was Austria. And one of the things she wanted to make sure as she was presenting her report, she had a sticker that says, there are no kangaroos in Austria. It's Australia. But she was being trained by mom and by dad and by grandparents about what had to be fulfilled in that report. It was a deliberate, planned instruction on the part of the teacher, but also the parents. And there were certain standards that had to be met. And then there was an admonition. The urgency and the why of this teaching, taking that time, protecting that cargo so that they will know in accordance with Psalm 90:12. Teach us to number our days. Or Ephesians 5:15. Redeem the time. We want their worldview to be one that says my time belongs to God. Just as we are trying to teach them, we understand that our time belongs to God. And we want to honor Him with our time. Second of all, don't burn the cargo of example. As you read Philippians chapter 2, Paul just really pours out his love and his admiration for Timothy and calls him my own son in the flesh. If you'll turn to Philippians chapter 2, I'm just going to read just a little bit. Philippians chapter 2. Look at verse 19. But I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you shortly, that I may also be encouraged when I know your state. I have no one like-minded who will with sincerity care for your estate. For all seek their own, not the things which are of Christ Jesus. But you know his proven character, that as a son with his father, he served with me in the gospel. Listen to that. You know his character. You know his example. You know his life. He has put himself in plain view for all of you to understand who he serves. Where did he develop that example? That sense of example, that need for that godly example? I say it points back to mom and grandmother. As they are teaching him about the things of God. They're teaching him that he needs to be the type of person that people look at and see Christ living in him. Do you remember those two songs, Cat in the Cradle and Watching You? Both have to do, the first one in particular has to do with a father who had a son. And son would come to him and said, Dad, can we do this, this, and this? And Dad says, maybe later, maybe later. And how did son grow up? To be the same type of man that his dad was. The example was there, and the example was wasted. And then the second one, Watching You, is about the dad driving down the road and the son sitting over there in the booster seat and has the Happy Meal, so to speak. He stops at a light and the son says a bad word. He says, Son, where'd you learn to talk like that? He says, Dad, I've been watching you. But that song has a redemption theme at the end where he listens to his son pray. He asked him, Son, where'd you learn to pray like that? Dad, I've been watching you. Example can be positive. The example can be negative. What type of example are we setting for our children, for our grandchildren in our homes? What do they see in us? Do they see that proven character? That first and foremost, our thoughts are focused and centered on the things of God, on God himself. Or they see us half-time, or half of the time, playing religion. Timothy was well spoken of by those brethren in Lystra and Iconium because he had an example. And he didn't care who was watching him because he knew that what he demonstrated in his life would show who Christ was. Don't burn that example. Talked about that example that he had. It was steadfast, it was uncompromising as far as his faith. If you go back and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 7, you see that we, as an example, are to be a model. I can remember my dad and even my mom. Yes, my mom taught me how to wash dishes. She taught me how to use the washing machine. And my wife will tell you, boy, I sure am glad you had your mama as your mama. because I still wash clothes and I still wash dishes. Not right now, but my mother was modeling that. And then my father, back when you could actually work on cars, my father would teach me how to put a new starter on, how to change the oil, how to align the headlights where they would go through inspection. It was a model. This is the way that it has to be done. And Christ is calling upon us, not just moms and grandmothers, He's calling upon all of us to be a model, to show what Christ is like, who Christ is, what Christ wishes for us, what Christ likeness should be instilled in our lives. Then if you look at Philippians 3:17, there's a pattern. A pattern, something that's going to be the same all the time. You don't deviate from that pattern. When it comes to our salvation, when it comes to living the Christian life, the pattern's been set for us. And then, practice. Look at Philippians 4:9. Paul says, these things which you have learned and received and heard and saw, there's that model, there's that pattern. He says, these do. These do. Practice it. Practice it. We all know what the old saying was, practice makes perfect. I don't know if you had much of a chance to talk to Dan when he was coaching, about the times he was coaching baseball. I promise you, Dan didn't get his team out there the day of the game without having even seen them the week before. Say, let's play. Well, Dan had practice because he knew that would hone the skills of his players. We have to practice our Christianity. Don't allow our example of cargo to be burned, because it belongs to Christ. It belongs to God. It is indeed in our possession. We can do with it whatever we want to do with it, but wouldn't you rather be that example that brings honor to the one who gave you the opportunity? And then finally, don't burn the cargo of the future. Do you think when Lois and Eunice were teaching Timothy that they said to themselves, he's going to grow up to be a great gospel evangelist one day? I don't know. You know what? He's probably going to be a great companion to another great evangelist. We don't know who that is yet, but he's going to be fantastic. He's going to be a great helper. I don't know if they thought that. But I know they were thinking about his future. They were thinking about him being a man of God and being a servant wherever God chose to use him. They were concerned about his future. They were not going to burn the cargo in regard to his life there. And that's what we need to understand too. We need to understand that God has given us cargo to get to a certain place, to the end of this life. And then we're going to give that back to him. We're going to give him back a life that understood the cargo of time and example and preparation for the future, especially that one that will commence when we stand before him on the day of judgment. So again, I praise mothers and grandmothers who are like Lois and Eunice. I had a mother like that, and I'm so very grateful. I have a wife who's a mother like that, and I'm sure you could point to your wife's husband and say, they're trying to. They want to safeguard their cargo. But more than else, Safeguard your cargo. Don't allow it to be used selfishly or unwisely. Finally, mothers, I came across this and I believe it's very true and it fits all godly mothers. The art of mothering is to teach the art of living to children. God has given us His Word to teach us the art of living. If you're in this audience today and you felt like you haven't protected your cargo as well as you should, as we talked about in Bible class this morning, never doubt that God's willing to forgive. God's willing for us to start over. He wants us to start over. And if you've got that cargo intact, continue to safeguard it. There may be a need this morning for you to publicly or even privately respond to the gospel call, to be an individual that says, Lord, I want to be better. When I get to the end, Lord, I want my cargo to be intact. So help me. Help me, my Father. Not only look toward the end, but look on how I get to the end. And if you need to respond to the gospel invitation this morning for any reason, will you not do so now as we stand together and sing?